In our last video, we put together this PC build with around $500 worth of components. And in the video before that, we reviewed this $500 pre-built gaming PC from STG Aubron. In this video, we're going to compare the two desktops and show you what the difference is between building your own PC for $500 and buying a $500 pre-built system. But first, let's go over the specs of each system.
In our PC build, we opted for an AMD Ryzen 5 5500 processor, ASRock's A520 HDV Micro ATX motherboard, Sparkle's Arc A580 Orc OC Edition graphics card, 16GB of Team Group's T-Create 3600 MHz memory, a 512GB NVMe SSD from Clev, Zalman's M3 Plus Micro ATX case, and MSI's MAG 650W bronze rated power supply, which in total came out to about $525. The STG Aubron desktop we reviewed came with an Intel Core i5 4590, which is a decade-old processor, an RX 5700 non-XT graphics card, 16GB of DDR3 memory, a 500GB SATA SSD, a mid-tower case that has 6 RGB fans. The system also comes with an RGB low-profile CPU cooler as well, and an unrated 650W power supply. STG Aubron also provides a keyboard, mouse, and RGB lit mouse pad, but the keyboard and mouse are on the lower end of the quality spectrum. The STG Aubron desktop came in at $490, so it was a little cheaper than our build, and it did come with some peripherals. But aside from the older i5 4590 and the STG Aubron, there were some concerns with the hardware. The graphics card, SSD, and power supply were all STG Aubron labeled components, rather than parts made by well-known manufacturers. We'll get more into that in a bit and why it's important to consider when comparing these two systems, but first, let's just dive into the benchmarks and see how these two PCs compared.
We benchmarked both of these systems in 6 different games. We ran Cyberpunk 2077, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Boulders Gate 3, Starfield, Fortnite, and Palworld.
In Cyberpunk 2077, our $500 build was able to run the game at non-ray tracing maxed out settings with an average frame rate of 73 frames per second, 80 frames per second at the high preset, 89 frames per second at the medium preset, and 97 frames per second at the low preset. The STG Aubron pre-built desktop was only able to achieve an average frame rate of 56 frames per second at the ultra non-ray tracing preset, 60 frames per second on the high preset, 69 frames per second on the medium preset, and 72 frames per second on the low preset. So that works out to a 25 to 30% performance advantage across the board for our build over the STG Aubron system. It's also important to note that the STG Aubron desktop also suffered from much lower 1% lows, which made the game run a lot less smoothly than our $500 build. Here's a chart that shows the 1% low benchmarks for each system. As you can see, our build averaged about a 60% better frame rate in its 1% lows over the STG Aubron system, which made for a significantly better overall in-game experience for our build. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the two systems perform much closer to each other, with our build averaging 66 frames per second on the Ultra preset, 67 frames per second on the very high preset, 71 frames per second on the high preset, and 83 frames per second on the medium preset. The STG Aubron system averaged 61 frames per second on the Ultra preset, 69 frames per second on the very high preset, 73 frames per second on the high preset, and 88 frames per second on the low preset. So interestingly enough, our build offered better performance at the Ultra preset, but as we turned the graphics settings down, the STG Aubron desktop gained a slight advantage, offering a 3 to 5 performance advantage. The 1% lows were fairly close as well, with the STG Aubron desktop having a noticeable advantage on the very high and high preset, and similar 1% lows between the two systems at the Ultra and Medium presets. In Boulders Gate 3, our system once again came out on top by a wide margin. Our build averaged 86 frames per second on the Ultra preset, 88 frames per second on the high preset, 101 frames per second on the Medium preset, and 126 frames per second on the low preset. The STG Aubron desktop averaged 63 frames per second at the Ultra setting, 65 frames per second at the high setting, 67 frames per second at the medium setting, and 75 frames per second at the low setting. That's a 30% performance advantage for our build over the STG Aubron system at the two higher presets. On paper, the STG Auron desktop doesn't look like it performed badly in Boulders Gate 3. 63 frames per second at the ultra setting seems like it would be playable. However, as we found in our review on the desktop, the game stuttered really badly when there were transitions between running around on the map and the dialogue cutscenes, and it made the game far less enjoyable to play. Our build didn't have these stuttering issues running Boulders Gate 3, and part of that was thanks to averaging about 60% better performance on its 1% lows. Starfield was the one title where the STG Auron desktop performed significantly better than our build. However, neither system was able to run Starfield well at all. Our build was only able to average a very disappointing 8 frames per second on the Ultra preset, and it wasn't able to hit even 20 frames per second on the lowest graphics preset. The STG Auron desktop performed much better on paper, averaging 29 frames per second on the Ultra preset, 32 frames per second at the High preset, 33 frames per second at the Medium preset, and 35 frames per second at the Low preset. Still though, those aren't good results, and the game really wasn't enjoyable at those low frame rates. So while the STG Auron desktop held an extreme performance advantage over our build in Starfield, the reality is that is only because our system did so poorly, and I'm assuming Starfield just doesn't run well at all on Intel Arc GPUs. Ultimately, I wouldn't recommend either of these systems if your goal is to play Starfield, and in reality, you're going to need to spend a bit more if you do want to get a system that can handle this demanding title. Fortnite was another game where our build offered a lot more performance. Both systems performed similarly at the Epic preset, with our build averaging 39 frames per second and the STG Auron desktop averaging 37 frames per second. However, as Fortnite is a competitive title, most gamers aren't running it at maxed out settings, but rather at much lower settings in order to achieve as high of a frame rate as possible. At the medium preset, our build averaged 100 frames per second, and the STG Auron desktop averaged 81 frames per second. In performance mode, our build was able to hit 148 frames per second, while the STG Auron system averaged 99 frames per second. Furthermore, our build saw much more stable 1% lows with an average of 72 frames per second at the medium preset and 87 frames per second in performance mode. The STG Auron desktop didn't offer as smooth of an in-game experience as evident in its 1% lows, with an average of 43 frames per second at the medium preset and 45 frames per second in performance mode. So while the STG Auron PC did okay running Fortnite, our build actually excelled when running it, and it maintained a high enough average frame rate to where you could pair it with a higher refresh rate monitor to gain a competitive advantage. In Palworld, yet again, our build came out on top. Our build averaged 56 frames per second on the Epic preset and all the way up to 93 frames per second on the Low preset. The STG Auron desktop averaged 45 frames per second on the Epic preset and 59 frames per second on the Low preset. That worked out to about a 20% performance advantage for our build on the two higher presets. However, the 1% lows really separated our build from the STG Auron desktop, and we really noticed it playing the game. Palworld ran a lot more smoothly on our build and a lot more choppy on the STG Auron system. Palworld is still in development, so I'm assuming the STG Auron desktop will be able to better handle the game as it progresses through development. But this is just another example of how much more performance our build offers right now. We also played League of Legends, Rocket League, and Valorant on both systems, and while we didn't run actual benchmarks, we turned on the FPS counter in all three games to see how these two PCs performed. Both of these desktops were able to handle these non-demanding titles with no problems, and either one would work if these were the kinds of games you wanted to play. However, our build did offer a performance advantage in all three titles. In Valorant, our build stayed in the mid to upper 200s for average frame rate, while the STG Auron desktop bounced between the low to mid 100s. In Rocket League, both systems stayed above 250 frames per second for the most part, but our system had a slight edge. And in League of Legends, the STG Auron desktop ran at around 100 frames per second for the most of the match, and dipped to around 80 frames per second during large team fights, whereas our build never dropped below 200 frames per second. So again, both systems can run these kinds of less demanding games easily, but our build was able to do it with much better overall performance.
For overall performance, our build shows that for around $500, building your PC is the way to go. Across the main 6 titles we benchmarked this system on, the $500 build won 4 of them handily, performed at the same level as the STG Auron desktop and Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and the only game where it didn't outperform the STG Aubron system was in Starfield, which, to be fair, neither system ran well. But still, it should be noted that the STG Aubron desktop did cost us only $490, whereas we ended up spending nearly $530 on components for our build. And the STG Aubron desktop came with a low-end keyboard and mouse, as well as an RGB lit mouse pad, which would combine for maybe another $30 extra or so if we were to purchase them separately. Furthermore, the STG Aubron desktop came with a copy of Windows pre-installed, whereas we used an unlicensed version of Windows on our build. If we wanted to activate Windows on our build, we'd have to spend either $30 or so on a gray market website for a license key, or over $110 for a legit activation code from Microsoft. It should be noted though that the STG Aubron desktop comes with Windows 10 installed on it, and the processor that it comes with, the Intel Core i5-4590, isn't even on Microsoft's supported CPU list for Windows 11. I believe there are workarounds to getting Windows 11 on a system that has an unsupported CPU, but it would be somewhat inconvenient if you wanted to upgrade to Windows 11 on the STG Aubron system. Either way, there isn't a huge downside to running Windows 11 unactivated, so it's not a big deal that our build doesn't have it, but if you want to do right by Microsoft, it is a cost that you have to take into consideration. Ultimately, when it comes to overall value, the STG Aubron desktop is cheaper, and it does give you a legit copy of Windows 10, and it does come with some peripherals. Even if those extra perks are enticing to you though, there is still the matter of build quality and future-proofing, and we definitely need to take those factors into consideration as well. Aside from the significant performance advantage our build has over the STG Aubron desktop, our build also does offer something that the STG Aubron desktop does not. It offers a legitimate CPU upgrade path. With the STG Aubron system coming with a decade-old Intel Core i5-4590 processor, there are no real significant CPU upgrade options for it. It's locked into using 4th generation Intel CPUs on its LGA 1150 socket motherboard. So if you wanted to upgrade this STG Aubron CPU, you'd also need to get a new motherboard and memory as well. Now, to be honest, our build doesn't have the best CPU upgrade path either, as the AM4 socket we chose to build on has been succeeded by the newer AM5 socket, and so we won't see any new generations of AM4 compatible processors. However, we can still upgrade the Ryzen 5 5500 in our build to something like a Ryzen 5 5600X3D if you live near a micro center, or a Ryzen 7 5700X3D. The A520 chipset motherboard in our build won't allow for an upgrade beyond that, but those are two decent options that should give us a boost in in-game performance thanks to AMD's new 3D V-Cache technology. Another point to consider when comparing these systems is that there are also serious concerns with the overall quality of the STG Aubron desktop. STG Aubron used their own branded graphics card, motherboard, power supply, and SSD. STG Aubron really doesn't have a name in the PC hardware market, and so it's difficult to determine the quality of these components. The power supply is unrated, and there are no expert reviews on it. Unfortunately, I don't have the tools or skills to tear this PSU apart and test it myself, and so there's really no way to know what kind of quality we're getting here, which is a bit worrying for a component as important as your power supply. And while the power supply we chose for our build, MSI's MAG A650 Bronze unit, isn't the greatest unit in the world either, it has at least received an efficiency rating from 80+, and it is at least made by a reputable manufacturer. This MSI power supply should be good enough to handle an upgrade to a mid-tier GPU in the future with no problems. But in terms of future-proofing and overall system quality, the STG Aubron has a lot of question marks, and our build will offer a bit more peace of mind. Ultimately, our goal with this video was to show you the difference between building your own PC and buying a pre-built system for about $500. Again, to be fair to the STG Aubron desktop, this wasn't the perfect comparison, as we did spend about $35 more on our build than we did on the STG Aubron system. However, we also only purchased the parts for our build from Amazon, and if we were to have shopped around on other sites like Newegg, or if we lived close to a micro center, we probably could have built this system or something very similar to it for even less. The bottom line though is that our build offered much better gaming performance, it has far better upgrade paths, and there aren't really any question marks on the quality of the components we used. There are other pre-built options out there for around $500 that may do one thing or another better than the STG Aubron pre-built system, but in the end, none of them will match the performance of our build, because if they did come with a more modern CPU option, they will almost assuredly come with a lower tier GPU, which would then also fail to match the performance of the A580 and the Ryzen 5 5500 in our build. So if you're looking to get a new PC, first we highly recommend you consider building it yourself. You'll get more bang for your buck, and it's not that hard to do. And if you do have $500 to spend, this build should treat you very well. We've linked to all of the parts we used in the description below. The PC hardware prices fluctuate on a daily basis, so the build could cost more than when we built it, or maybe prices have dropped on some of the components and it now costs less. You can check out the written version of our $500 build guide on our website, as that will always have the most up-to-date part list. In any case, that does it for this comparison video. If you found it helpful, please give the video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.